extra credit. Those of you who participated in our last lecture series are familiar with this format. This is really just an opportunity for us to discuss topics related to our session theme. And our session theme for fall 2024 for Romancelandia University is book censorship, literacy, advocacy. So all of our discussions are really going to be centered around advocacy and literacy as it relates to access to books. And when Emily and I read The Finest Print, I was frantically messaging her, like, we have to talk to Erin as part of our session. This is so perfectly thematically tied into all the things that we've been thinking about in this session. For those who have not read Erin Langston yet or don't know Erin's work, she is the author of several New York Times featured novels and novellas. So Forever Your Rogue being her debut novel that is probably the best known. And then, of course, the two interconnected novellas, Some Winter's Evening and A Day Until Forever. And then her newest book, The Finest Print, which is what we'll talk about for the majority of our chat today. But so grateful to have Erin, and we'll kick it over to you, Erin, just to talk a little bit about yourself and your path to being an author, just an opportunity to introduce yourself real quick before we dive into the meat of the conversation.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. And thanks to Emily and Kelsey for inviting me to come chat with you today. So I started, my debut was published, Forever Your Road came out in February of 2023. So that was kind of my first foray into writing. And that was the first book I wrote. It was the first book that I published. And I'm an indie author. I'm a very proud indie author. So all of my books are self-published, and that has been quite a fun an interesting learning curve. And I live in Northern Kentucky. I am an academic librarian by trade. I do come from I've always been a researcher. My academic background is in history. So I have a master's degree in addition to library science. I do have a master's degree in medieval history. So I have always loved reading and researching and being involved in historical spaces, but I didn't start writing historical romance until a few years ago. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you today talking about my research and some of the questions you guys have got me thinking about. And yeah, just excited to share more today.
Well, and that's my new Erin Langston fun fact. I did not know that you had an additional master's in medieval history. So maybe that will inspire me to read more. I'm short on my medieval historical romance, and maybe one day you'll write us a medieval historical romance. But for today, we'll talk about Victorian England.
Sure.
And so really appreciate that you shared a little bit about your background in academic research, librarianship, and wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because specifically thinking of Ethan and Belle's story and The Finest Print. And anybody who follows Emily and I know that we are fans of a detailed author's note, and you never disappoint in sharing your research and your background into kind of how you developed the story, what led you to these specific characters or this specific conflict. And really wanted to start with just one, how unique The Finest Print is as a window into Victorian England, where we are not with aristos. We're not spending time with the upper class. We're not spending time in balls. There's really not like a social scene in the book. We're truly going between the courthouse and the print shop. And that's very unique in historical romance, even in Victorian England outside the Regency period. And wanted to get a sense of what research nugget or what kind of led you to like, I want to write, in this next generation story about print working and genre fiction, because that it's such a unique little nugget of time and a different perspective into this period. And I'm just curious, like what you found that led you to this story.
Yeah. So what happens for me is I always have my characters first before I have anything else. Before I have a plot, well before I'm ready to actually start writing, I sit with my characters for a long time and I tend to develop the interior of them and establish that before I do anything else. So I'll have a good sense of who they are, personality, their motivations, their flaws. And then when I'm ready to start writing, I'll usually begin by trying to establish how would this person move through the world? Like, what does their world look like? What does their daily life look like? And so, and what opportunities and challenges a person like this would face, in their historical context. So my research and plotting all really stem from trying to figure that out. So like, how would this person have existed in like, a fictional version of Victorian England? So, I mean, when you asking about like print work and so Ethan specifically, kind of led me to his story, not the other way around. So my real first kind of strong sense of that character was of like this newcomer arriving in London, like putting his boot in the mud and being like, this is where it's going to happen for me. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, who's this guy? And so it was just kind of, I had a sense of this like up and comer, a man who wants to establish himself, a tradesman. And I had an idea that he was going to be a printer specifically because I had Belle first and I knew she was a writer. And all my early daydreaming was about that, the printer and the writer, and kind of like wondering what that could look like. So once I was kind of like hooked into that, what happened was I basically was like, all right, I got to figure out how this man, what's he going to do in England? Like, what's he going to do? How's he going to make something of himself? It was funny. Like I had like a spreadsheet. I was like making him a business plan basically. And I was like, what's his business going to be? I think maybe a newspaper. Like he's a journalist. He's a newspaper man. Like that's kind of cool. Maybe they'll write something kind of like investigative journalism-esque. Like I wasn't totally sure, but I was like, let's see what it would take to get this guy to start a newspaper. And then my hopes were dashed because a poor foreigner with no income, resources, or connections can't start a newspaper in Victorian England because it's too expensive. Like the taxes, I started looking into this and I was like, no, like I was like, these numbers don't work. The numbers don't work. You can't start a newspaper. It's too expensive.
Erin, can I interrupt and ask you, is this when you decided that he would not be putting his boot into mud?
That came later.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. His first take, he's not like impressed by London at all. Like, nor does he ever become enamored with it. But yeah. Um, yeah. So I was really frustrated at that point because I was like, well, he can't start a newspaper. I don't know what I'm going to do with him. Like, I can't really make this happen. I was also frustrated equally at this point. And I know you had some questions about pennybloods, so we can get into that in a little bit, but I was having a hell of a time figuring out how to find a path forward for Belle and like her love of the dark and twisty, because I had that kind of brewing already. And like, no matter what I did, I felt like I was coming up against a wall. I couldn't figure out what I was going to have these people work on together. That would, yeah, I don't know. I just was really frustrated. I was like, it's not going to happen. And then I kind of had this spark of like, well, that could just be what the book is about, right? The book will just be about them realizing that they can't get anything off the ground. Like, it's going to be about him realizing he can't. My frustration with him not being able to start a newspaper would just become Ethan's frustration that he can't start a newspaper. And my frustration that I couldn't figure out, what kind of genre to have Belle write in would be her frustration with failing as an author. And so that kind of just became like where we took the plot from there. So yeah, it's really character driven kind of stuff for me. But this time around, I just sort of let their frustrations be like my frustrations became their frustrations. So
That's
yeah.
fascinating. Well, and it's such an interesting turn because having rounded up recently some of our favorite historical romances that center journalism and journalists, that is a more common like entry into like if you're going to have writers in the time period to have journalists. And I am so impressed that you really took the business plan approach to understand like could he have afforded this as an outsider, as an American, as somebody without inherited money? And I had never really considered this. I did not know the knowledge tax exists, and obviously we're using knowledge tax in air quotes. It's
Mm-hmm.
not called the knowledge tax, except, through protest movements and those opposed to it, obviously. But would love to learn a little bit more about the use of taxation and that. I mean, it created a class divide in like who was able to publish news, read news, buy news, access news, and everything else that could be published. And curious, you had this kind of hilarious note in the author's note just around like, it's hard to make tax the villain. That's a different kind of story because usually we have very real, physical, big bad villains in historical romance. And taxation is a thornier one to try to make feel real and present for the reader. So would love to learn a little bit more about the knowledge tax and just how you wove this into kind of a class difference romance.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say just, I guess, maybe a little bit like historically about what that was, and then kind of how it played into like the book and like because it's, all the different things that how it played out in the book with readership and things like that. So, um, knowledge tax, the tax on knowledge, like you said, Kelsey, it's this kind of umbrella term that we can apply kind of retroactively, or like, at the time they were using it, in protest, like you said, but it's referring to a tax on news, paper, and advertising. And advertising doesn't actually play into my book much, but that would have been a reality for a newspaperman, right? It's not like this was taxing publications is unique to the Victorian period. I think I saw like 1712 was one of the earlier dates that I had seen where we have publications were being taxed, but it was a half penny at that time. The price of the tax, the tax increases over time. And so when we get to the end of like the Napoleonic Wars, we had the tax at 4 pence for news. Ridiculous, right? And so that's just so newspapers were carrying a really high fiscal burden beyond any other kind of publication at this time. Newspapers were also really strictly defined when you get into like the late 18 teens, early 1820s. So a lot of restrictions on how often they could publish, how many pages they could be, the cost, like the price, what the price point was. And what this effectively did was squash political papers, radical, cheap political papers. It also made it very hard for provincial newspapers outside of London to get their footing. In the 1830s, this kind of comes to a head. And again, this is all prior to my novel, but they called it like the War of the Unstamped. And so in the 1830s, we see hundreds of radical publishers that are being penalized for selling unstamped news. People were jailed, presses were seized, fines were levied on these men. And it kind of worked because eventually they did lower the tax from 4 pence to 1. So it was a penny by the time we get to 1848, which is when the finest print takes place. And then just kind of on the back end, like what sort of happens after the time of my book. If you have read the book, you'll know that Ethan kind of starts talking to some different publishers and some different groups that are like, there's mentioning of, oh, like we're kind of working against this stuff. So in 1849, the Newspaper Stamp Abolition Committee is formed by a group of publishers. And there are like movements and fits and starts like all throughout this. Like I am simplifying this, but essentially we see in the 1850s a repeal of the taxes on advertising and news. News taxes were abolished in 1855, and then paper was the last to go in the 1860s. So we do kind of see the shift. And then this aligns with, I think, even before I started researching this, I think of like the proliferation of newspapers in the late Victorian period, and so like this is when that is able to happen, when these taxes are ending. So in terms of like just kind of how this affects class and how readership and things like that kind of plays in here. I mean, it's, first of all, we mentioned this, right? It's expensive to establish a newspaper. It's a risky endeavor. So you see the news being produced by, the establishment, right? The news is being produced by those who have the resources to do it. And it's also being consumed by those who have the resources to do it. So you're seeing, in order for them to turn a profit, they have to, even with the 1 cent penny, the 1 cent tax, because of paper duty also and some other factors, newspapers were priced at like 5 or 6 pence a piece in 1848, which is just out of pocket for working class folks. And I want to add here really quick though, that like, this is one reason I ended up having Ethan come from America and not just outside of London. Because originally I wasn't necessarily sure he was American. I just knew he was coming to London from elsewhere, and that he had no connections in London. But I ended up making him American specifically because I wanted that juxtaposition of the information landscape. because Ethan is coming from a newspaper that he worked on that is a 1 cent daily paper. America had penny papers in as far back as the 1820s, 1830s. So it's very different. You know, you have these working class newspapers in America way before you have them in England. And Wellbell's family is like pretty progressive, and like, you know, she's maybe sort of sympathetic to like the cost, you know, of the paper. I mean, that's not like an issue that she's really like taking on, right? Like it's not something she's like grappling with really, because it's just the status quo for them. You know, there's like a scene where they're eating dinner and kind of chatting about, and they're like, oh yeah, like the news taxes, blah, blah. And Ethan's like, no, this is like messed up, you guys. Like that's like really expensive. And so I think that there was like kind of an outside lens I wanted to sort of bring in to kind of showcase that there was, you know, what that impact might have been. I also think, you know, beyond the tax on knowledge and the tax on news, there is something that you know, that's interesting just about the cost of reading in general, right, at this time. So, you know, when we think about accessibility and affordability, this plays into fiction as well, right? It's not only the news. In this time, we see more and more people acquiring literacy. So it's becoming more of a viable path for someone to be entertained through reading. In the Victorian period, we have like parish schools, Sunday schools. There starts to be increasing regulation around compulsory primary education. So more and more people could read, but then it becomes a question of like, what are they going to read? Bound books are prized possessions to be acquired, right? They're extremely expensive. So, you know, you could buy a book. The way that you could buy books or access books in this time is like, there's a few things that you could do. There's the triple decker, which is a novel published in thirds. Okay. So you have volume 1, 2, and 3. It's not a trilogy, but it's like, you know, you take my book and you cut it into thirds and like you buy one volume at a time. Those would be maybe 5 or 6 shillings a piece. They could be as much as 10 shillings a piece. So you're looking at maybe 30, anywhere from 18 to 30 shillings for a book by the time you've made that investment. That would be half a week's pay for a middle class household. Okay. Let alone a working class household. You could belong to a circulating library to get your books. The membership is 21 shillings a year. So possibly something a middle class household could invest in if that was like a huge, you know, if that was very important to them. That would be like a big sacrifice, but they could do it maybe. So you get one book at a time. Well, if it's a triple decker, you get one volume and then who knows when you get the second one, right? And then you also have part books, which this is how Dickens was published. So a book that's serialized into 20 parts. Each of those parts is a shilling. So again, you're at 20 shillings by the time you're done. Now, I don't know if you guys are like familiar. Like the one thing I had like a little post-it note, like sometimes on my laptop that I would like look at was like a shilling is 12 pennies. I had to like remind myself of this all the time. A shilling is 12 pennies. So if you are a young working class man, you're coming home from work, you stop by the corner stand, you want to read in the evening, okay? You could buy one installment of Dickens, or you could buy 12 pennybloods, right? Like, but spaced out over time. So like, you know, you can you can get 3 months of Bell's Pennyblood, or you can get one installment of Dickens. And so I think that the economy of scale is like important to remember here. It was a big shift for me. Like when I wrote Forever You Rogue, I'm talking about the aristocracy, right? Like money's not really something like we're thinking about like much, you know, like, or we hear vast sums, like, you know, Ethan's trying to pay off £100 debt. Like that doesn't seem like that much money, but like I really tried to kind of always position for like a working class person what this amount of money really is. So yeah, it's just this proliferation of penny fiction really changed the reading landscape for a lot of people in the Victorian period, because now they had something that they could read with their friends. They can share them because they're not prized possessions, right? They're on pulp paper. Like we hear the term pulp fiction, right? Like so it's the paper on this cheap pulp paper, cheap fiction. They swap them, they share them, they pool their money, they read them to people who can't read. You know, there's accounts of people reading on the street corners together. And so this kind of there's this gap, this wide gap that between people who could read but couldn't afford things, you know, and pennybloods really kind of filled that gap. So anyway, that was
It's
kind
such
of
an interesting thing to bring up because like even think about reading like Pride and Prejudice. Um, Lizzie Bennet is always reading fiction, and reading fiction is seen as like lesser than, you know, studying the classics, you know, or and it's like we've always sort of like placed what people are reading into like tiers of importance. And
mhm.
you can look at like what you just said, like, do you want to pay 12, was it 12 shillings for, or a shilling for, sorry, I know, one shilling, 12 pennies. I need
I
that.
know. It's like, yeah,
It's like, do you want to pay for one installment of a Dickens novel, or do you want to get 12 pennybloods, right? It's like so much more bang for your buck. But then
right,
somebody who's like of the higher classes can like look down on what you're choosing to read, what you're choosing to spend your money on. And it's
right,
like that you think you're like, well, when did that all kind of settle? And it's like, well, no, because we are romance readers and we are constantly told that what we choose to read is somehow less valid
right.
than what someone else chooses to read.
Well,
Absolutely.
it
Yeah,
immediately, like as you talked about the start of the pulp fiction, pulp paper, I think it's good for us as readers to remember that so much of, and that's why like Ethan as a printer, a physical printer is such an important part of the story because so much of reading access literacy is the business of making books, pamphlet,
Mhm.
like making the material. And the more expensive the material, the more important the page, the words on the page, supposedly, like this is the
hmm,
dichotomy that we keep creating that still exists today. Like you were talking about pennybloods, and I kept thinking of like all my mass market
Yes,
paperbacks, which are offset printing, they're on cheaper paper, they have cheaper binding, they are made in the hundreds of thousands, in
right.
stock and quantity because they're considered cheaper, less than. And I had this horrifying discussion with my sister who used to work at Half Price Books. And for those on the call who are collectors of mass market paperbacks, Half Price Books is one of the only places where you can reliably find romance paperbacks. And we're all searching for like our prized possessions. And she was like, Kelsey, there are thousands sitting in the back. And the first thing you did before you were fully trained was organize the romances because it was the least important, lowest stakes. Like, and it was just wild to hear like her perspective and her training and her experience as like even
Yeah,
shelving the books like we prize and collect and buy. And I think it's just this reminder to me of, to Emily's point, this isn't like unique to the Victorian period.
right.
We have just found ways to virtue signal with
Yeah,
reading forever. And we will keep
forever.
finding ways to make certain books more expensive and certain books cheaper or less than. And
There's
so I think,
also
yeah,
something I think here about the current state of like book bans in the US and which
yeah,
books are targeted, and the fact that these mass market paperbacks are going extinct, and now suddenly a book that used to be $6.99 in the same exact format is $8.99, but that format is printed less and less, and you're much more likely to find that exact same book only available in trade, which is going to be like a $17 investment. And it's
exactly.
like we're finding ways, even before you get to the banning, the outright banning of the books, you're finding ways to limit access. And
Yeah.
it's really insidious.
it's really,
No, I know. Yeah. There's definitely an element of everything old is new again here that was kind of eerie as I was writing this book. There were a lot of parallels that I was kind of like becoming, aware of as I was going. Yeah.
I saw a panel at StimulatCon where Jeannie Lynn was speaking, and she was saying that there's this myth in like when we think about historical settings for literature, there's this myth that progress is like a straight line that starts in the past and it gets better and better as time goes by. And so she writes books that take place in the Tang Dynasty, and people are inclined to think that it's going to be very like dark ages in terms of progress. And she's like, you gotta start to understand that like things come back around, things are cyclical.
Mhm.
We're capable of being just as regressive today as we were during the Tang Dynasty. Like,
Yeah. No, but seriously, listen. So there's this quote, and it didn't make it into my author's note, but like, I want to read this because this is what, it's from the Seven Curses of London. James Greenwood's writing in the 1860s. And this is what he says about pennybloods. Okay. The main difficulty is that the tens and hundreds of thousands of boys who stint a penny from its more legitimate use to purchase a dole of the pernicious trash in question have not had enough of it. Nothing can be worse than this, except the purveyors of letterpress offal have not had enough of it either, but have grown prosperous and muscular on the good feeding of their monstrous profits, and they are continually opening up fresh ground, each patch fouler and more pestilent than the last. So they're like, that's Belle's, that's what she's writing. But like, I mean, right? Like it's not that different from like book banning language we hear now about stuff, right? Like that this is seedy, trashy stuff that's spoiling these boys. Like these boys are being lured in by these publishers, you know?
Here's
So
the like sin of gluttony. It's like our consumption of them that is somehow like suspect. The fact that we enjoy them so much and we can read so many of them. And I feel like, yeah, it plays right into the book banning language that we see across the country.
mhm.
And
yeah,
this idea that like
Melissa in the chat just noted this is how people feel about graphic novels
Graphic
today.
novel, comic books, where this is how comic books used to be talked about back like in the, when they were becoming bigger in the 20th century. It's how people talk about video games, right? Like, I mean, any type, it's this media censorship stuff. And pennybloods were blamed. There were court cases at the time that they'd say, boys are committing crimes because they're being like their minds are being spoiled, like by reading this stuff. Like it's glorifying violence, and I was like, this is what the same thing that we say that we, not us, but people say now. So
yeah.
very, very wild.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I know Emily and I recently were doing, as we were researching for Prison Ban Books Week, and just thinking again about how, like, you don't have to outright ban things to ban things. You don't have to, like, through this structural, creation of separation between what is considered worthy literature, what is considered dangerous literature,
Mhm.
as we were looking through these lists of, like, books that are banned for prisoners specifically, it's like anything that includes information on chemistry, anything that includes math, like the
Right.
amount of information that is considered dangerous to people that we have imprisoned, it's just truly eye-opening to see the various ways that we criminalize literature, books, reading, and find it to be endangering for people, which is fascinating, especially when you think about the kinds of reading that we love to do. And that's why like I want to segue into Belle as like truly just the most relatable character. And I love that you chose gothic fiction, which for romance readers feels there's kinship there because
Yeah.
we're similarly grouped into this genre fiction, pulp fiction category of like the lesser genre
Mhm.
fictions. And so even though I am not, as my sister would attest, as the horror reader in the family, I am not a gothic fiction reader. I do not have Belle's capacity for blood, horror, mystery.
No, nor do I. I mean, there's a reason that we don't. People will be like, "Are you going to publish The Secrets like Clementina Bloom?" And I was like, "No, because I don't know what's going on with that oyster fork. I don't want to know. Like, that's not for me to know." Like, that is
It's perfect though, because it feels like it's so relatable to us as romance readers, even though
Mhm.
it's not our genre. And so I'm really curious and just wanted to kind of continue the discussion in this like genre fiction and there's a great joking moment with Belle and her family where she's trying to like pass off her project as a literacy initiative. And
Yeah.
it's like intended to be tongue in cheek, like we're supposed to laugh at it. And then, but also we're supposed to say like, heck yeah, because she's
Yeah.
trying
Yeah.
that
She
people
gets
are
there. I mean,
reading.
she's like, I have a great, like, yeah, this will be what I tell everyone. And then she's like, puts her chest behind it eventually, like, yeah, she
Yeah.
realizes it too. Yeah. And that's also, I mean, that's kind of the point of the print shop world too. Like we start throwing in the guys, like all the people she's hanging around with all the time. And like, you know, it's like kind of showing like this is these are people who value her and her work and you know that kind of a thing. So that was sort of a fun part of that too. But sorry, so you were asking me something about the
No.
gothic, the pennybloods and the gothic stuff.
Yeah, and I would love to talk a little bit more about pennybloods and just their role kind of in society at this time. But also what you just said triggered for me too. Like I hadn't even thought about Belle's journey in being proud of what she's written and how
Yeah.
that relates. I think every single person on this call, everybody in Romancelandia University can tell the story of becoming proud of being a romance reader, right? Like that
Yeah.
is a journey because of all that internalized shame and just kind of patriarchal ideas about literature that we have to really unpack. So one, would love to just learn a little bit more about pennybloods and how they
Sure.
functioned at this time. And two, like Belle's journey to being proud of being a writer of pennybloods and not necessarily a Bronte writing Gothic fiction.
Right. Yeah. So this was interesting because it's like when we talk about like you know gothic fiction is a genre is vast, right? And like there's a like there are hallmarks of it that you know the more like the brooding hero and like the manor house and the moors and like there are things that are you know that we kind of resonate and it was a legitimate form of literature at the time, right? Like this was an acceptable form of literature. um and women were writing it, right? So sometimes people will say to me like you know that Belle, you know, they talk about how Belle was struggling because she was a female gothic fiction novelist, and it's like I mean that didn't her being a woman and you know writing maybe not the most popular genre or whatever like that's those were like strikes against her maybe or like might have made things a little bit harder, but certainly there were established female novelists of gothic literature at this time. The real reason Belle is failing is because what she's truly writing is crime fiction and detective fiction, which did not exist as a genre yet. Like she's decades ahead of her time.
Oh,
So
pioneer.
sorry.
To the pioneer, I
Oh, pioneer. Yeah, sorry. Yes, she's a
yeah.
definitely a pioneer. And it was kind of this moment where um, you know, I made her an Edgar Allan Poe fangirl, like, but for two reasons. One, I figured like that's kind of a fun way for a modern reader to immediately get a certain vibe from Belle, right? Like that evokes a vibe from of her. But also because Poe was kind of like the only, as writers would say now, like comps, like, you know, that she doesn't really have comps. Like there's not like people on the shelf she can point to and be like, that's what I'm doing. So in the 1840s, the early 1840s, he published he has his Auguste Dupin characters. So that's like the Purloined Letter, Murders in the Rue Morgue, like her favorite, which is actually the most boring of them, the Mystery of Marie Roget. So like in those Poe stories were like not they were like failures for him, like right, like they were not successful because people wanted his paranormal stuff and his horror stuff. But until we get Sherlock Holmes in the 1890s, like there's not really, yes, there are detective or police like characters, but like this idea of like a sleuth, especially like her sleuth is like a courthouse maid. Like, I mean, this is not, people are like, they don't know what to do with this, right? Like there's not like a way for her to, so that's really why she's kind of failing. Um, but where we do see criminals and crime and mysteries and detectives are in pennybloods, right? So that's kind of like where these stories were being told. I know that in my novel, like they refer to Varney the vampires. That's like a paranormal pennyblood that their apprentice is like obsessed with. I would talk in my author's note about the string of pearls. So that's Sweeney Todd. Like, so we've maybe heard of some of these, but the one I really kind of used as my inspiration for Belle was called The Mysteries of London. And that was published in 1844 and it ran in 52 weekly parts. So it like ran for a full year. And that was kind of like, you would have all these different characters and like they would go, this thing takes place like you're in the catacombs, you're in ballrooms, you're in like all over London, like exposing all these different aspects of the life and city life. It's called like a city mystery kind of now. And I was like, that's kind of the vibe of like her penny blood, right? With this courthouse, you know, secrets of the Old Bailey and like all of the crimes that happen there. So that's kind of like, if I figured, you know, if I wanted my heroine, or, you know, if my heroine wants to write all this like dark and twisty and unsavory stuff, that's where it's possible, right? Like that's where there's a hungry audience. And I will say this is kind of like an interesting thing about penny bloods. Like, because of how they were printed, they were really agile and responsive to, like, for lack of a better term, like market trends, right? So one kind of like tongue-in-cheek thing for me personally as I was writing this is like, Belle and Ethan take their business very seriously, like their craft, right? Like they're like, he cares a lot about, he wants it to like be laid out nicely, you know, he's like trying to get the spacing exactly right when he's like doing his composing stick. She's very concerned about her writing, like, right? But in reality, these things were written like they would just end in the middle of a sentence. Like if you got to the end of the eighth page, it would just stop. And the next week's issue would just start in the middle of that sentence again, right? Like they were just filling lines. And if they stopped selling or were not popular, the next week it would just be canceled. And like next week, it would be just a different story, right? Like you would just have no resolution. It would move on to the next. Like, and so the fact that we have these stories that are going on for issue after issue after issue is like testament to the fact that that was working, like that was selling, right? You know, that there was a hungry audience for it. And that people were consuming them because, you know, like you have a full year's worth of Mysteries of London. It's like clearly that was an investment that was worth making, right? And there are some scholars who say that that might have been the most widely read single work of fiction in the mid-Victorian period, is that Penny Blood. Which I just love that for Belle, honestly, right? Like, you know, I love this idea.
I love that for romance readers everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
right? That you let the market speak for itself, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think that, you know, it was really kind of fun and fascinating to kind of think about all of that. But, you know, it also made me think not just about, because we talked about like the production of these things and like the content of them, right? So like there's all kinds of different paranormal and, you know, the bloodlust and there was romance elements, all that kind of stuff. I intentionally didn't have her include romance in hers because that felt a little bit too on the nose, you know, like for me. It was like, we're going to have her go a slightly different direction. But it also made me think a little bit about how books and literature are disseminated and different attitudes about that in terms of, again, what we find is like worthy and valuable. And I mean that specifically like about indie publishing, right? I mean, Belle and Ethan are essentially self-publishing. She can't find a publisher, so they make their own path and they meet their audience where it is. Like, you know, and I know as an indie author, like we have on Bookstagram a really, really wonderful and supportive community that embraces indie authors. That is not the broader experience of an indie author, right? And I know I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know I personally have encountered negative perceptions and stigma against self-publishing. Like you can't get published from a traditional publisher, or like I'm not going to buy a book that's indie published. It's not as high quality. And part of me is kind of like, okay, that's fine. But you don't get to meet Nate Travers if you don't read my indie published book. I'm just kidding.
Oh, yeah.
Just kidding. No, but I'm just kidding. But no, it's just one of those things where it's like, there is something to be said too of just not even the content, but like what we see is like, and that doesn't mean that there's one model that's better or worse than anything. I mean, all the models are complicated and hard. Like all authors are doing the best they can, like regardless of if they're trad pub or indie pub. But there was definitely some connections I was making as I was writing this, thinking about like how literature is also valued by not just its content, but how it's produced and how it's disseminated. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah.
Well, and even thinking like your concept around they were able to be so responsive to market trends. Holy heck, are we seeing that now with indie authors driving market trends and driving and actually being responsive? Like indie publishing has pushed diversity across the industry because more diverse voices are able to actually get their stories out to readers. Readers are demanding more of those stories, and it's making traditional publishers not necessarily do their own work, but pick up authors who have already established platforms. But I mean, it is so relevant to what we're seeing today, and even to the extent of like seeing traditional publishers trying to snap up indie authors because they recognize, and it's like to your point back in the day when pennybloods eventually like like who knows if we would have had the detective and crime fiction that we had later in the century had we not had pennybloods and that
Right.
kind of foundation.
Established audience. Like, yeah, this kind of sense of people would buy it because that's the thing. And it was kind of like, even referring back to that guy's quote of like, oh, like these kids, like, but it's like, that's where the money was going,
Yep.
right? So eventually you kind of get, and that's, and there's this part of the book too, where eventually Belle and Ethan are kind of like, screw it. Like, we're just going to do our, like, they're going to make their own way, but they kind of like would have been successful. I mean, we know historically that would have been a successful endeavor. I based Ethan off of a real publisher who met a great amount of success doing this. So, it is interesting, but yeah, you're right. The market and agility piece is really, there's a lot of overlap with what we're seeing today. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And it's so cool. Like it provides so much excitement in the story to see as their Pennyblood starts to gain readership. And we can see so much of like what we see in our day-to-day lives as, an author or a story starts to gain steam and, becomes trendy. And like we're all participating in this cultural moment and the excitement of that, of all being part of something, which I
Yeah.
think the Pennyblood gives that to Belle and Ethan and people that can just talk about it. They have shared conversation because they've
Right.
read this.
And I think I didn't get to say, you had asked me just kind of about her feeling proud of herself, but I think that's essentially what it is. There's a moment, and again, I'm trying not to be like spoilery here and stuff, like, I don't know, but there is a moment where she is like, she hears people talk about her work a few different times. No, and people don't know she's the writer, right? Like, so, and sometimes it's a little squishy, like not the best feeling. And sometimes it's like, oh wow, like they really like it. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's that feeling of like her starting to see that there is value in it. And also just kind of getting to that moment where it's like, I think one of the more powerful moments in her journey is she has this realization of like, now that she has spent so much time, and again, it's not like she doesn't give off like spoiled rich girl vibes at all, right? I don't think so. But like, I didn't see her that way. So I don't know if it comes, but really, I think she does, from spending a lot of time around working class people, the newsboys and the guys in the shop. And like, she has appreciation for what a working class person's life is like. She asks Ethan at one point, like, what do you do for fun? And he's like, I don't really do anything for fun. Like, what do you like think I do? Like, do you not see that all I do is work? Like, well, he's kind of, don't go by Ethan. He's kind of a loner, but like, I mean, in general, like, I think she has this appreciation for like, these are good, hardworking people that like deserve to have something that's just fun. Like, she's under no illusions that what she's writing is like amazing
Yeah.
prize winning literature and stuff. Like, I mean, she knows, like, she's like, yeah, it's pretty weird. Like, I mean, like,
Yeah.
but she's like, but people deserve something fun. And I think that's kind of a moment where she feels like proud of herself. So yeah, which is how we feel as writers and readers too. Yeah.
Yeah. That it's okay to enjoy what you do and read, that's not inherently less. Like I hear this even as we talk about like audiobook accessibility and all these things that it's like we find ways to shame people for consuming more books. Like that somehow like by virtue, I had somebody try to and you said this so well, Erin, that like in Instagram, in our beautiful corner of romance bookstagram, it's so supportive. And you sometimes forget when you step into your day-to-day life that you're
Yeah.
not in that space, that you're not with a bunch of like-minded people. And I was talking to somebody, in my day-to-day life about audiobooks, and their frustration was this idea that you could listen to a book while you do other things. Like, because then you're not like really sacrificing the time to read the book. But it's
Oh,
like
because reading should be a sacrifice. You're right.
Yeah, yeah. It
We should be suffering. We should be suffering.
It should be hard and boring, and you should hate it.
You should have, and the like also like what goes into this that makes me think of Ethan, you should have free time because you have enough money to have free
Yeah,
time. Like,
Right.
it's like there's a classism to that. That's like we still make books like this pedestal that like wealthy enough people can enjoy good literature because they have studies with leather armchairs and
Yeah.
support
Yeah.
or whatever, and they can sit and read their very intelligent, serious
At
book.
the end of a long day of owning
Lawyering.
land and riding horses, you should
Yeah.
you should put on your banyan and sit in front of your fire and have a
Right.
little dram and maybe crack open a book before the
But you
light.
know what? I would posit, I would just say maybe they would have enjoyed the pennybloods more. Maybe that would have been like a more
Yeah.
fun read. Do all of that, but like, see what the vampire just got resurrected again. Like that might be a little bit more interesting.
I
Right.
would freak out if I was reading about the vampire being resurrected and the edition I was reading ended mid-sentence. And then
Yeah.
it got canceled the next week. And that would happen to me because I famously love stuff that other people don't like.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of her Netflix shows get canceled after one.
Right.
Dang
Yeah.
it.
It was
Okay,
it was
really,
it was
really
very much like
quickly.
that. It's very dicey. Like I'm not going to start this until we know if it gets a season 2. Like
Well, okay, you know what I thought of because Elizabeth Gaskell was a contemporary of Dickens and she had serialized publications too. And I listened to like 20 plus hours of Wives and Daughters on audio and then got to like a pivotal moment and some guy cuts in and is like, unfortunately, Elizabeth Gaskell died before she finished this. But here's how we think it would have ended.
oh my
Like,
gosh.
what? What did Molly and what? And that's just them's the breaks, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Before I forget, for our RU students who are looking for some extra credit for attending this lecture,
Mhm.
the word that I would like them to DM the Romancelandia University account is, remember, you can at Romancelandia Uni DM us the words oyster fork.
Oh,
Oyster
I
fork.
like that.
Claim your extra credit. Okay.
Oyster fork with
Anyway,
your feet.
back to our regularly
Yeah.
scheduled programming.
No, I love just how many parallels there really are because the timelessness of class divide of like so many of these like literacy advocacy and just access issues is it's going to be the same across eras because people have all the same faults and same
Yeah.
hang-ups.
Unfortunately, we haven't gotten better. Like, what?
Have been improved. Yeah, we're just not much better. But it also made me think, and I just a shout out to how you navigate power imbalance. And you said this, and I don't think that Belle comes off as spoiled rich girl, but I really appreciate that you do have, Belle is not aristocracy,
Mm-mm.
but she is still of a different class than Ethan is. And you've done a really nice job in showing that working class and middle class are different things in this time as they
Yeah.
are today. Like that there is a very big difference, and it's easy for us as romance readers that read primarily historical romance and primarily in the like Regency to Victorian, early Victorian period, to think it's like aristocracy and everybody else. And that's just not like there's so much
There's
stratification there.
more.
And
Yeah.
she is certainly more aware than like a gently bred lady would be of certain things, but she does not understand Ethan's day to day. And I really
Right.
appreciate in a class divide romance where we get that nuanced approach to like she has more agency because of, being the daughter of a judge, having that just kind of family network support, middle class upbringing. But she also has some of the limitations of being a woman, like being on
Right.
her own in a way. So there's just a lot of nuance in Ethan and Belle's power imbalance that I really appreciated. And I don't know how, I know you said you start with characters and then try to figure out how they'd live in the world. I don't
Mhm.
know at what point in the process you're really thinking about like, how do I balance these two people so that they can come together? I'm just kind of amazed by how that comes together. I know it's not effortless, but you make it look
Yeah, I don't really have, I think, a set answer for that because I think it's just something that plays out with their personalities and in the draft and in the scenarios and things like that. But it was something I was really aware of. Um, he's not a self-made man, right? Like he's literally in the act of making himself, but she also is not success. I mean, like in the way that there are a lot of things like he has more agency, like you said, because he's a man but she has more agency in terms of class. Like, so they're that kind of, but really they're both kind of like losers, for lack of a better term. Like they're outcasts. Like, so then they fit together on that level. And there's a lot of fun ways that I think, I mean, I essentially too, there are some intimate scenes where I kind of got a shape of what their power dynamic would be. And then I could from there go back into the rest of the draft and like, you know, because that's, I think, in the bedroom where you can really
Mhm.
get a good sense of that, of what their dynamic is. And like, and so that sort of helped me shape some of their other dynamics too. But
I
yeah,
think there's also something in here that's really great because this is a next generation story that's like building off of one of your novellas. And so you're not like, you're in a position where as a writer, you don't want to give Belle like a tragic backstory that like ruins her parents' HEA.
right,
So
right.
what you've done here is you've given her like a quirky personality that makes her a little bit of an outcast.
Yeah,
And that is really deftly done because she does have this like sort of like happy childhood and this like
right,
healthy family life. And without those things, the reader is going to start to question what happened in Gavin's book, you know? And
right.
so it's really nice that you haven't done that. I'm thinking so hard I'm about Lorraine Heath.
I was gonna say Emily is just steaming out of the years about Lorraine Heath destroying HEAs through second generation.
Lorraine Heath.
You thought they were happy, and then their only child disappeared for 19 years. Let's see his story.
Yeah,
Oh my
like
gosh. Yeah, no, for real.
you
No, I
can't
definitely
do
didn't.
that.
I was like, I'm gonna have to write like a really like healthy family. So that's gonna be good. But there was a part too where I was like, okay, well, her parents have to like leave at some point. Like I like
Yeah,
had to
yeah,
like
they
get them
have to
out of
like
there. Like, you know, I was we got to feel like so that I had to figure out. But yeah, and I gave her some, she has some scandal, like, you know, she's sort of she's like, well, it's not really a spoiler because it happens like on
Yeah.
the first page of the entire book, but like, you know, she breaks an engagement. So like, but again, because she has like a good family and she's like, well, I don't want to marry this like awful person. Like,
Yeah.
so, you know, I kind of tried to give her just some things related to her own, yeah, like you said, her personality.
Even her scandal at the beginning of the book contributes to her freedom of movement because
Yeah.
now she's like a little bit older. She, she's
Yes.
middle class. She goes out, she goes to the Old Bailey, she runs around and does other stuff. And like there's like
Yeah.
a moment early in the book where instead of going to the Old Bailey, she goes with Ethan. And as a reader, I'm like, oh, is her dad gonna be like, where the hell were you? And he isn't because like she isn't a grown-up who's like allowed to like spend her
Yeah.
days how she
And
chooses.
they kind of say, like, I think her sister at one point is like, well, Belle's like doesn't do anything that interesting. Like, you know, for somebody who could get up to business, she's kind of like with their dad, or she's like at the courthouse or like writing somewhere. Like she's not like a blue stocking in the way of like that she's trying to like go out and get into like shenanigans really. Like this is kind of like her only shenanigan that she's ever really like otherwise she just kind of wants to like do her own thing, but what the thing she wants to do is pretty boring. Like
I
she
just
doesn't like get into
She's
stuff.
the best. I mean, you've done something really hard in like not only having a villain that is taxes, but having a good, healthy family, which it's just so much easier to write a bad family
It
when
really
you're
is. It really
trying
is.
to create
Yeah,
backstory.
it's
But
really
she's
easy.
got like loving parents and loving siblings. So it's like, how do you make a character interesting when like all the obvious villains are
Yeah,
not there? And
right.
pitch
I think
perfect.
it's done really well in this
Oh,
book.
thank you.
There's so much in here that is so relatable to like today's environment,
Yeah,
politically and like surrounding books and accessibility and also surrounding today's feelings about genre fiction. It's like it's all there and it's just it's wonderful as a romance reader to read a book where this is the situation. And I loved what you said about how Ethan isn't a self-made man. Like he can't get there without Belle. He can't get there without
yeah, yeah. He's not like a Clapus. So
no.
no, he's like 20 years before we get to one of them, maybe.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
Yeah.
if any, I mean, he's literally like, I don't have $7.
Yeah.
Which is so real for the
Yeah.
time, but
And
also
they do need each
so
other, which is really sweet. I really love that. I love that he's not afraid to like rely on her and vice versa. So that was really special.
Mhm.
I loved writing that. That was a different kind of dynamic. So
Yeah. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I would just ask you, are there, is there any nugget of, why this book is special to you that you hope readers take away from it?
yeah, I mean, I think that we hit a lot of the things. I mean, just to what we were just saying, especially like I really, really loved I loved the partnership angle that I got to explore in this book. And I really loved just the immediacy of writing like very ordinary kind of lives and like ordinary circumstances. Like there's not a lot of, I don't know, like there's not a lot of drama in the book, which, sometimes I was writing this, I was like, okay, like, I don't know, like, but there is too. It's just everyday kind of drama, right? And so trying to create those heightened stakes was really fun. But yeah, I guess that's what I would say is like the thing I most enjoyed about it was just writing about these people trying to figure things out together and like, getting that 10-week, because it's just a 10-week snapshot in their lives, right? Um, and how they come together to trust each other and that they really are, I loved writing like their honesty and like their, kind of commitment and things like that. That was just fun. It just felt like a different kind of, I don't know, it just felt very different and refreshing to write. And so I hope that that resonates with folks too. It's been fun to get to share this story. So yeah. And like we said, all of the parallels with things that we're facing today, things that I notice even in my job as a librarian, like there's a lot on with the information landscape. So I think that this book was a really kind of fun micro level way to like really just hone in on like two people working within the system, not even trying to buck the system, but just figure out how to make it work within an oppressive information landscape. That was really special. And I think that I learned a lot from writing this book, and it made me just kind of think a lot about things that I'm facing today in my job too. So yeah.
Well, I love that because I know Emily and I felt that reading it. I felt like I learned a lot about not only the period, but it definitely helped as we have done our research on present day issues and trying to kind of pull together our RU family around certain like advocacy paths in book access. And this has shaped a lot of those thoughts just around genre
Oh,
fiction and literacy. So
yeah, I'm so glad. I'm glad to hear that.
It's been such a treat to chat with you. So
Yeah,
thank
this was
you so much
great.
for your time.
Yeah,
we're
thank
so
you for inviting
grateful.
me. This was fun. This was really fun. So
This
yeah.
was awesome.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you, Erin. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We'll go ahead and sign off. Enjoy your
All
Sunday.
right. Have a great Sunday.
Take care.
Bye.